and all the other sections that we'll be having each week. They'll be filmed, so they'll be available if you can't make it in person. But they're definitely more of an opportunity for you to engage a little bit more with the material and provide a little more guidance on all the projects.
Okay, so 4 p.m. Pierce 301 this Wednesday. And future Wednesdays, the GCal captures the schedule. All right, so let's do this. Let's suppose we want to actually implement an API for courses. And what is an API in this sense? It's really our own model. So it's a PHP implementation of API via which we can talk to a courses database. And we're going to borrow some of these design patterns, namely DAO and the singleton pattern, to accomplish the following. First, let me go ahead and load courses.php. This is example 0 if you're following along on paper or online or want to afterward today. So this is it for now. Let's actually have this DAO class that does relatively little, but it gives us this helper method that earlier I called getCourses. So getCourses' purpose in life for now is to return for me an array of courses from my database. Now let's look at some of the salient characteristics here. So one, in reverse order, what am I doing down here? I have in my getCourses method a courses array that's initially empty. Then I'm doing this. Anyone know what this one-liner is doing besides getting an instance? Or what is that representative of? So this isn't quite factory. Factory actually would churn out multiple objects, a new one every time it's called. This is logging into the database, and this is actually an embodiment of that singleton pattern, whereby I've decided with version 0, you know what, I'm going to talk to the same database all the time. My project's not yet complex enough that I need multiple databases, so singletons are OK for the database. And a very common paradigm, though it can take other forms, is to have a class, let's call it database, and then a method inside of it called getInstance, but it could be called anything. Java people tend to write it this way. And what it does is it returns a database object. But if you call it again, it returns the same database object again and again and again. And the upside of this is that probably that method is doing my connection to the database, and then I can funnel all of my queries through it. But I don't need to go through the overhead. For those familiar with networking, there's no overhead of TCP connections, connecting to the database, authenticating. All of that takes milliseconds, which I don't want to spend cyclically. So let's suppose for now that I now have my database handle. This is equivalent, if you think back, to the return value of MySQL Connect in CS50. So now I execute this query. It's not a prepared statement. It's just a raw query, select star from courses. And then in PDO, this is the equivalent, this third to last line, of MySQL fetch assoc to get an associative array. All right, and I just copied this from the documentation after reading up on the fetch method. So what is this doing? In a loop, it's getting an associative array from the courses table and putting it in the variable called row. And then this syntax here is appending to my courses array that row again and again and again. So what do I get in the end? I get a huge array of courses, and each of those course is represented not with a class, but how? What data structure am I using at the moment to represent a course? So just an associative array. So it's a very poor man's approach to storing data in some kind of structure. In fact, this is almost what CodeIgniter does. CodeIgniter instead returns to you a standard class object. The only functional difference is that you then use arrow notation to access fields instead of square bracket notation. That's really the only difference. And here, too, is where CodeIgniter's nice and simple, learning curve relatively low, but sloppy. Like it's not actually returning to me a course object. So we can improve upon this. So let's actually see this in action. I wrote a terribly simple test script just to see what's happening. So I'm importing courses, and I'm calling getCourses as follows. But we'll come back to the syntax in a moment. And then I'm just printing recursively that array. So let me go ahead and run, whoops. All right, so what did I do wrong? Unknown database. Oh, sorry. I need to change my database to use, not project 0, but lecture 2. Sorry. OK. So something's wrong. Courses. Ah, that's why. Thank you, Tommy. OK. Database. Let's do this week's lecture. Oh, thank God. OK. That could have gotten awkward fast. All right. So All it did, actually that was a little too fast. All it did was it dumped a huge associative array. Right before I hit Control C, we were up to location 1011, each of which is an associative array. So not bad. And in fact, each of these associative arrays is, it's kind of nice. It's kind of like encapsulating information, but there's no methods associated with it. They're completely public, these fields. I can change them accidentally and the like. So we can do a little better. But a word on syntax. Why do I have these double colons here? Courses, colon, colon, get courses. What does the double colon denote in PHP? Yeah. Yeah, so it's what's called a static method. And if you remember, if you took a PCS or something similar, if you remember nothing else from Java other than the fact that every week you wrote public static void main, static does have special meaning in these various languages. And in the context of PHP, the static keyword, which I actually did have here in the file we looked at a moment ago, means that this class called courses will have one and only one copy of this method. And that's actually not quite true, because you're not going to multiple copies of a method per se when you have multiple objects, but rather it means you do not need to instantiate this class called courses in order to call this method. So inasmuch as getCourses, in my mind, is like a helper method. I want to be able to call it, but I don't want to have to instantiate a stupid courses object just to call one method inside of it. The static approach allows me to express exactly that. I can just say, as we saw, courses getCourse, or getCourses, and I can do something like this. If I did not have the static method, I would instead have to do something like this. Let's say courses model gets new courses. Then I can say courses gets courses model arrow get courses. So I could call these things anything I want, but the point is that for the DAO design pattern, whereby you essentially have a layer of abstraction in code in front of your database, and you want to provide helper functions like getCourses, it's not strictly necessary to instantiate an object, because I'm not encapsulating any information. It's really just returning a whole bunch of data from the database. Yeah?
So it's like the equivalent of a Ruby class method.
Yeah, exactly. It is a class method. Static means class method, to be more precise. Exactly. And we'll see these same kinds of things actually in Objective-C next week. All right, so back to this. What's inside of this database class? It's actually the same idea. So in the database class, I made a few design decisions. I'm using const. So PHP actually has a const keyword that allows me to specify inside of a class some number of constants. So I'm just copying and pasting DSN, password, and user. Why did I use const instead of just using the define function as we've used before? Like, why put these constants inside of the class all of a sudden as opposed to at the top of the file like we've been doing for some time and did in 50? Yeah?
You don't want them to be globally available?
Yeah, it's simple as that. Like, now we're sort of getting better at designing software and encapsulating related information. There's no reason that I need to pollute my global namespace, so to speak, with these constants that have only something to do with the database and have nothing to do with courses per se or any other code or PHP's own framework code at all. So I might as well scope them as narrowly as possible so that only the guy who cares about them can access them. So by putting them inside of this class, I ensure that they're still accessible. And in fact, they're actually globally accessible as class constants, which itself is a bad thing, but we can fix this. But for now, the point is that we've encapsulated them. And if I scroll down, here's my getInstance method. And this is actually quite common in PHP if you want to have static variables as well. So notice this method is static, which means I do not need to instantiate a database class. By contrast, in CodeIgniter, when you load the database library, as you did by changing that configuration file, thereafter you can say $this arrow DB. That is instantiating a database object for you to use, even though it just has various helper methods inside. The singleton approach is not necessarily best, because we already said earlier, if you want to have two database connections, you're kind of screwed in this model. So this is not necessarily great, but for our simple problem here of just a course project, it's pretty reasonable. So you can also have, and this is fundamentally unrelated here, static variables inside of a method. What a static variable is inside of a method is a variable that there's only one copy of, and even after that method returns, the next time you call it, that variable will have the previous value. So it retains state. It's a way of calling a method, and even though normally, recall that when functions are called, you build up the stack frame, you tear down the stack frame up and down, and therefore you're losing those variables. By having a static variable inside of a method or function, you're essentially saying, okay, you can have the stack frame back, but let me save that variable's value so the next time it's called, it has retained its previous value. So the upside of this is the following. If I want to ensure that I'm only ever once instantiating a new PDO object with these three constants, and that's the syntax for accessing a class constant, self : : notice I just check. If DBH is not set, go ahead and set it by instantiating this object, else just return the previous instantiation. So it's a very common paradigm in PHP to ensure that you only do something expensive once, and thereafter you cache that information. Now, for those of you with more savvy with object-oriented programming already, if your mind's kind of fast-forwarding, we could do this another way. We could get rid of both static keywords. We could require the user to instantiate a database